Eric,
Omar,
we have to give the people what they want.
you know what? I feel like we'd be failures not to do so.
Failures. Well, it's interesting you say that because I want you to explain within 1 minute what the audience thinks they're about to learn and then what this is really philosophically about, because this is a meta conversation on society, really what they're getting at. So first explain what they think they're into, training to failure, and then what actually will be happening.
In less than 1 minute.
Thank you.
What you're going to be getting, or what you think you're going to be getting, is a breakdown from PhD candidate Zach Robinson and principal investigator behind the lab at FAU, fellow reviewer, Dr. Mike Zourdos, and a longtime returning guest. And part of this, I believe this is the fourth MASScast we've had, actually a fellow host to us and our guest, Zach Robinson, on the MASScast. What you think you're going to be learning, because I've already eaten about half my time just introducing Zourdos, is you're going to learn everything about the meta regressions that are currently in preprint that tell you everything and all there ever has been to know about training to failure. But what you're actually going to learn is that you don't know anything, and none of us know anything, and that nihilism is a seductive path that we're not going to go down. But instead, we're going to bring you back from the brink and teach you what was really done in this paper and what you can know, and teach you how to think more critically. Thank you very much for your time, and that is exactly 1 minute.
Whew. Folks, we're back in that existential cave. Ever since Mike Teixeira introduced it to us saying, you don't know what you don't know. You have a pen light. I believe he described it, Eric, that sometimes it's flickering, so you're not even sure if it's on, what you're seeing, what's being illuminated, direction, which way you're going.
And the cave is changing.
I mean, it was the most
So
stark.
it's a bad cave.
You think the submersible was bad. Anyways, we are back now. We're going all the way. Speaking about failure, we have Zach Robinson on. We have Michael Zourdos. Michael, it says on Skype. That is so weird. Does anyone ever call you Michael?
I thought this was a professional show. Is it not?
Dr. Zourdos, I apologize.
I'm just trying to be prepared, as a university professor and, a co-host, one might say, for the day. Just it's be good to bring that kind of structure and formality to the podcast. So I was hoping today, at least for me, I was going to stay professional and not make any jokes. I thought, my full name would go really well up there. Besides, at any point in the podcast, I might have to instruct Zach to get back to the lab, to leave and write another paper, to teach a class. So
you mean Zachary?
That's not his name.
Zachariah.
In my house, we affectionately call this individual Big Zach. The Zachary you're referring to is the better Pokemon card player of the two. So if you're referring to that Zachary, yes, there was on Thanksgiving, I believe, quite a battle between Little Zach and Big Zach. But so we can always revisit that. But I'm trying to keep it formal today, so I use my real name. I would hope that everybody else would do the same, and we could have a respectful discussion.
Okay, so I want to get into this, but Zach, to be clear, your full first name given to you at birth by your parents is Zach.
Correct.
So is that a statement about your parents, or is that a statement about you, that they thought you didn't deserve the full name, or that they were just like, you know what, I'm not really, they were feeling a little lazy. Like, there was labor where we're young, we're young adults, like, you know what, we got to write it all out, and like birth certificates.
One might say they
paperwork.
failed as parents.
They might. But I will say where they failed, you succeeded, because now you've been back on Iron Culture twice, and I can think of few things that should be seen as a successful mark of a life lived to the fullest, more than being on Iron Culture twice. In fact, the few things are being on 3 times, 4 times, or 5 times. So you've accomplished one of the, 3 or top 4 things one can do in life. And we're back with you on to once again discuss the topic of training to failure. Previously, we had you on, and now we have you on again because of a highly well-cited, not even published yet. I'm saying it's cited, but I mean like people are referring to it. But it is a preprint. And as far as a preprint in the scientific literature in sports science can go, within that context and those very limited constraints, it's setting the world on fire, is what I'm saying. So folks, welcome Zach Robinson back, and we've got a really good discussion lined up because within minutes of this getting published, or at least a day, there were a lot of hot takes, a lot of misinterpretations, and even I felt the pressure. I need to talk about this preprint on Iron Culture with Omar, because I knew that it was going to be a bit of a perceived as a paradigm shift, which I think is probably an inaccurate assessment of it. And I see you nodding. So I wanted to jump on and talk about it, but I thought, you know what? I wasn't a part of this paper. I know this topic well. I've been involved in this literature area, and of course I do know Dr. Zourdos, and I know, soon to be Dr. Robinson. I'll go ahead and put the PhD-C behind your name for this. Okay, Mike's not feeling it, but for those who don't know, I'm actually adjunct faculty at FAU, so I'm involved, very much so, in sometimes saying "Great job, guys," on Trello. So incredibly involved. No, but in all seriousness, I'm part of your PhD committee. I was aware, but I am not you. I am not Dr. Zourdos. I wasn't part of the paper. So I think the first place to start, since we've already introduced the paper on the last episode, is just to, from your own, explanation, what was the primary research question of this series of meta-regressions? What were you trying to answer? And what do you think is the primary take-home? We'll start there, and then we're just going to get real deep.
Perfect. Yeah, well, first and foremost, guys, thanks for having me on as always and giving us an opportunity to kind of discuss things here. As you said, the really cool thing about preprints and making drafts of scientific writing available is that they get way more eyeballs on them than if you kind of keep them in the dark of the publication process the entire time. The potential downside of that is that you get rapid misinterpretations of research that has not undergone the peer review process and some things like that. So here we are discussing some more of the nuanced findings and hopefully not, disseminating sound bites of things that can woefully mislead people. So that's the goal for today. As far as kind of the research question associated with this project and kind of just the origin of it in general, as you know, I've been interested in this topic for a very long time. This is what my master's thesis was on, as we discussed on the last episode of Iron Culture. As well, obviously, Dr. Zourdos has written extensively on this topic in Mass as well, and also is very interested in this. We've had countless conversations on this topic, and the thing that usually comes up in those conversations is that while we can be relatively confident on certain, general conceptions of how proximity to failure influences, adaptations to training, particularly in this conversation, hypertrophy and strength, there is some things left to be desired in terms of totally understanding how that is going to influence those adaptations by a more continuous analysis of the variable proximity to failure. So this is where we kind of got the gears turning on, hey, this probably needs to be done to kind of push this part of the research question forward. How can we go about doing that? And that started this long, laborious process of many roadblocks and limitations and learning and frustration and caffeine overdoses that led to this project eventually after about 2 years of plugging away on Excel. So again, just to simplify it, the point of the kind of the analysis was we wanted to somewhat approximate, and I'm going to use the word approximate because, as we'll discuss, there are many, many limitations and subjectivities that go into the approach that we took by necessity. This area of research is, I would say, still in its infancy in terms of defining, reporting, and controlling proximity to failure appropriately. So we had to make some liberties, I would say, in terms of actually quantifying this to allow us to even investigate the research question in the first place. So we're aiming to investigate the dose-response relationship, meaning a more continuous analysis of RAR and its influence on strength and hypertrophy. And so that was kind of what we sought out to do. And like I said, there's a lot of different decisions that needed to be made to allow us to do that I'm sure we'll discuss. In terms of, before we even touch on anything else, the way that I think these results should be viewed and kind of the lens in which I would view these in terms of application is I would use this to say, on a very basic level, what is the directionality of the relationship between RAR and a given adaptation? That's about where I would stop in terms of confidence. You could, there's been a ton of misinterpretations on exactly the way these relationships ended up looking, the playing into that, probably way more than we should. But at the end of the day, I think the thing that we can be relatively confident about is the directionality of these effects, to which there is a ton of nuanced interpretation and even just subjective lens of interpretation that you could take to maybe have a slightly different angle of applying those or even interpreting them. So to me, that's how I would view this, is that this is a first step in terms of trying to approach this research question in this way. But there is a ton of things that need to happen in the actual original research before in 20 years we can do this again and be way more confident in the results. That's ultimately how it comes down. And so, the way that I would view this is just, here are the basic directional effects of proximity to failure on these different adaptations, to which we can tentatively use from a practical perspective. But as we'll discuss, there's a ton of different nuances and practical things that would influence you in the way that you apply those actually when you're writing a training program.
I think it's a great initial start there, and just some things to kind of color in the detail of what you're referring to. We've got a number of meta-analyses now on failure versus non-failure training, and they were always binary in nature historically. There have been a couple out of a few different groups, and then most recent published one, because this is a preprint still, was the one led by Refalo and colleagues, which I was a part of along with Dr. Eric Trexler. And we still basically did non-continuous analyses. We just had multiple ones where we compared momentary muscular failure to non-failure, where we compared other definitions of failure to non-failure, and where we compared different velocity loss thresholds, which are you could analyze continuously, but we didn't. We just had a cutoff point. So a continuous analysis is saying, hey, this variable, proximity to failure, which we quantify as RIR, may have some type of dose-response relationship, or perhaps not a dose response, but it has a continuous relationship rather than just kind of like a group versus group comparison, which you might think of in RCT. So I think it is very commendable that you did that, because it helps us understand the relationship of proximity to failure with the outcomes we're interested in, rather than just the less than nuanced question of should we be training to failure or not. So I think that's really, really valuable, and I think it is an important step. And you mentioned that it is more telling us about the directionality of the effect rather than the specific nuances. I'm assuming that's because the confidence we can have in the actual RIRs in each individual study meta-analyzed is, I would say, limited, because it's not like you went, okay, we're only going to take studies where they familiarize the participants with RIR guidelines, they slapped an LPT on the bar, and they also did, LVPs for everybody, and also analyzed, what is their average velocity at different RIRs, and we're only going to include those studies. Because if you did that, you'd have two studies. So I think the fact that you guys took this approach is fantastic, but I think it's also shows a lot of humility and professionalism that you're saying, hey, we did our best to estimate the RIRs of each of the individual studies involved, so we could do a continuous analysis. But there is, let's say, a very specific term, fudginess around those numbers. So let's talk a little bit about that. I think with that kind of background, how did you guys estimate the RIRs that were used in the studies that were included? Because I think that is probably a principal point of confusion and maybe even questioning related to these meta-regressions.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is, in all the soundbite stuff, this is the unfortunate bit that is absolutely crucial to the understanding that just completely doesn't get talked about. So as you said, the necessary component of even performing this analysis in the first place is that we needed to quantify proximity to failure in some way. And so obviously the candidate approach, and the one that we ended up taking, was using the repetitions in reserve kind of concept, and ultimately estimating those values for every single study that we included in the analysis. Obviously, there are some studies that do report RIR-based RP directly, and so that kind of creates this concept to which we kind of bucketed the studies into kind of 5 different areas. And so there was an estimation approach that we utilized for each of those 5 different areas. You have failure versus non-failure studies. You have studies that do directly report subjective RIR. You have studies that report velocity data. Then you have alternative set structures. And now I'm missing one that and then those that report repetitions and load performed. And so throughout all of those, there are a number of limitations and assumptions we needed to make to estimate RIR within any one of those studies. Let's go through one example. Probably the most straightforward example is a failure versus non-failure study. One group reports to have trained 3 sets of 10 to failure. Another group, using an equivalent load, performs 6 sets of 5. What we did for that example is the group that reported, let's say, the definition there, to avoid ambiguity, there was concentric failure. They provided some sort of definition to say it was involuntary set termination. That group was coded as a 0 RIR or failure for one of the analyses. The other group was a simple subtraction problem. On average, they're performing 5 reps per set, and we subtracted 5 from the other group with an equivalent load. You get 5 RIR. Right there, we already have a number of issues and assumptions that we're making, right? The first thing is, as data from our lab has established and numerous other papers as well, percentage reps performed at a given percentage of 1 RM are extremely variable. So we're already making the assumption that the average repetitions performed is going to apply across all individuals, and that's going to lead to this nice, neat RIR estimation at the end of the kind of tunnel there. That's obviously probably not a safe assumption to make. So that's the one limitation. 2, we have set-to-set fatigue, right? So, people set to set, their capacity, I would say, at a fixed load is going to decrease. So the RIR is naturally going to fall, although that is influenced by a ton of different factors. Probably sex, probably rest times, probably the actual initial proximity to failure to which you're training, the repetition range, a host of different things. So ultimately, we felt, for a variety of different reasons, that there's counteracting effects that could kind of bounce the RIR in either direction. An example of one on the other side would be groups that don't have a very systematic way of progressing training loads. That's going to naturally inflate the RIR as you get stronger. So there's kind of competing things that would kind of influence the RIR in both directions. So we ended up saying, that's really difficult to account for. Let's just go with the average reported reps, and let's take that as the RIR estimation. But as I just said, there's a number of different things that we're just assuming don't influence that RIR estimation that we just kind of have to take at face value. So again, probably not a super safe assumption. And then let alone the way in which training was performed. There's a ton of different ways you can perform 5 repetitions at a 70% of 1 RM, different concentric intents, different pacing strategies, etc. Tons of different things that can ultimately influence that RIR, in addition to different exercises, different resistance profiles, hundreds of different factors that we really just can't know. So all of that is to say, I wouldn't have selected the estimation approaches that we use if I didn't think they pass some sort of face validity kind of perspective. Because I do think, when I read these studies individually, I think they get us pretty close. But I would be lying if I said there's not all these different factors that we need to keep in mind that probably bias them in some direction. We just don't know which way that goes. So coming back to your original point, in why I think focusing on the directionality of the effects is probably the most important. If you think about that across all these different studies, those little biases that could occur, although I think a strength of what we did is we try to use very consistent estimation approaches. So they could be biased in one direction, but trying to keep them biased in at least the same way, if that makes sense. A couple of those effects bounce a different way. The best fit model could change. And that, additional studies get added. Our RR estimation is slightly different for a given exercise. All those kind of things could bounce those little data points in a little bit of a different direction to change the directionality or way the best fit curve looks. Ultimately, the directionality, let's say for muscle growth increases as we get closer to failure, probably is a relatively safe assumption, but the way that curve looks is subject to all of these little estimation errors that I wouldn't hold a ton of stock in saying this is exactly how that relationship looks. So I think that is the number one thing to keep in mind with the estimation process, in addition to all the other limitations that I mentioned and how that could influence things.
Let's spend just a little more time here, because I do think it is actually the crux of the whole analysis. So you talked about, I think, the most intuitive way from many of the failure training studies is, they did 10, hit failure, the other group, same percentage of 1 RM, and they only did half. So 5 RIR in that example. How did you estimate failure from the alternative set structure studies? And then how did you estimate, or I should say RIR, and then how did you estimate RIR from studies using velocity?
Sure. So for alternative set structures, that's definitely the one that is the trickiest to kind of understand. So the way that we did it was there is some data that kind of looks at our ability to perform repetitions with a given set structure. And for the most part, performing alternative set structures maintains your ability to perform repetitions at a given load relatively well. Whether you're looking at velocity, outcome. Go ahead. Yep.
And real quickly, just for those listening, alternative set structures, we're specifically talking about cluster sets and rest redistribution sets. So you're taking breaks between repetitions compared to a group training traditionally. Go ahead, just so the listener knows.
Absolutely. So introducing those rest periods either between repetitions or adding additional rests in either one of those alternative set structures seems to maintain our performance pretty well. Now, there's some data that is really surprising, and we mentioned one of those in the paper that basically shows essentially no performance decline for a very, very long time, even with really heavy loads. That basically, we kind of take all that data together to say, it's, to me, a relatively safe assumption, given that most of these little mini sets are going to be very far from failure, that we're going to be able to maintain that relatively consistently across, all of the mini sets. Obviously, again, that's beholden to all the same limitations that we already discussed: set to set fatigue, differential interset rest intervals, what exercise are we doing? Are they unracking the bar? Where all those kind of things that could influence that. But again, we had to make a call there, and it seems a relatively safe assumption to me there that we basically took whatever one of those mini sets were, rated that in terms of its RIR, and considered that the average estimation for those conditions. So for an example, there's one study that comes to mind where one group did 3 sets of 10 with a 10RM, and the other group did 1 repetition every 19.7 seconds or something like that. So we just rated it off that single repetition, in which they're spacing that out to achieve the same total number of reps, in which that repetition would be considered 9 RIR. So that's essentially how those conditions worked. And then coming back to velocity, there was kind of 2 ways in which they could do velocity. Obviously, we have the big group of the velocity loss studies, which we utilized published equations from the groups that have done those studies that basically predict the number of repetitions in reserve based on the exercise, the load, and the velocity loss that was performed. And once again, as your one of your PhD students and one of the other authors on the paper that I was fortunate enough to work with and collaborate with, Yvonne would say that is probably not a super stable way to evaluate repetitions in reserve. Nonetheless, that's what we had to use to kind of approximate those. And I think given that it's the same lab, very similar kind of methods, I think that's a relatively good way of doing it. And then there were a few other velocity studies which we would utilize other published velocity loss equations for free weight exercises, for example, that weren't in the very same conditions as the Smith machine studies that kind of dominate that research. So it's very similar kind of concepts, but utilizing kind of different bits of information and published research to kind of approximate the maximum possible number of reps performed at that given load, subtract the number of reps that they performed, boom, that spits out your estimated RER.
Dr. Helms, can I chime in on a few of these things here?
Please do.
Please.
So just for everybody listening or watching, I want to highlight a few things that Zach said and how he went about it. And so first and foremost, I just want to highlight the extraordinary difficulty of doing something like this. And when he said at the outset, it took him a couple of years, that's not an understatement. He's not exaggerating the process. And it's not because he was working slowly on it. To the contrary, I thought he was working quite quickly on it. It's such an enormous undertaking. And the magnitude of studies included in this meta-analysis was, Zach can speak to the exact number better than I can, but let's say about double, at least, than any other failure meta-analysis. That is not saying this is an inferior or superior analysis. It's just a different question. So what went into it was extraordinary. Now, to do these estimations, right, I can tell you that Zach agonized over how to go about them. And we went through many different iterations of what was appropriate, many different text messages, many of those conversations ending around 7:30 when I go to sleep, and then him getting a response from me again at about 4:30 in the morning. And many, many times trying to figure out the best way to go about it. And ultimately, you have to make a call. There were many emails sent, probably an email sent to every corresponding author of every paper that was included in the meta-analysis. Sometimes you get a response, sometimes you don't, for whatever reason. You ask questions, but we try to figure out more. Can you tell us more about how close they were to failure? What happened? Can you give us the reps that were performed, and then we can estimate? Sometimes you get that and you can make more precise estimations, and sometimes you don't. When looking at these, you can't possibly know, as Zach pointed out earlier, kind of some of the individualization. So we can't know the individual rates of fatigue either, not just the individual ability to perform reps on a single set. What I mean is, if somebody's performing, 5 sets at 70% of 1 RM or whatever it might be, and they're doing that for 10 or 12 reps, let's say that first set is a 3 RIR. And that's what they report, then you go with 3 RIR. Now, we all know by the 5th set, they're probably at a 1 RIR, maybe a 0 RIR. But if it's not reported in the study, the meta-analysis can only utilize the information that it's given. And then to go above and beyond that, we contact the authors that are there. And sometimes they respond, sometimes they don't. Maybe they just don't get the email, they get busy. No big deal. That happens, right? I'm sure I've missed responses too. And sometimes they don't have that data from their own study. They're not thinking about that while they're collecting the data. And so if it's a 3 RIR in the first set, maybe it is a 1 or a 0 RIR in the last set for some. Now, in that case, the 3 RIR is not accurate of all of the sets. And we know that's the case when we do the analysis, but we don't have any other options, right? So all you can do in a meta-analysis is, or really any research study, the biggest thing I think that's most important is objectively state what you did, right? Just be clear about what you did so somebody knows. And then the reader can say, hey, all right, they did this. I see this as a limitation. Or, hey, that was a good job. They tried to work on this or whatever it might be. And now, if we go back to the point 2 of the rate of fatigue, somebody else might not fatigue, right, over sets at a 3 RIR. There's a paper out there, I forget the author now, but Eric actually had reviewed it in MASS before, but there wasn't a big rate of fatigue. And so now maybe, let's say training to failure, we see this relationship and training to failure is a little bit better. Now, if maybe you only need 1 set going to failure to be able to see that. We don't know that. We could not answer that question from this study because if it was a submaximal protocol, then everything was rated at that same RIR and we can't know. So there's so many things that we can't answer. The last thing before we move on or get back to you guys that I want to point out is we and Zach, we went to great lengths to highlight this in the paper. And the biggest thing we always do is, and I'm always telling the students, is always be cautious in your writing. We don't know. Our analysis only tells us so much. So if you go to the very last line of the paper, it says, researchers and practitioners should be cautious interpreting the findings of the present analysis, as proximity to failure was estimated and its accuracy cannot be confirmed. So I would plead with everybody to read the paper and to read the writing that Zach puts out there. And when reading the discussion for the first time, when we were going through it, I remember Zach talked to me about how he went to great lengths to avoid using terms such as 2 RIR, 3 RIR, 4 RIR, and saying if you're at this RIR, this is the growth you're going to get, because he simply could not say that from the analysis. I guess I lied. I have one more thing I want to point out, which is that this, if anybody is familiar with my writing on this topic, this is the opposite of what I would have expected, right? So my hypothesis going into this was that we wouldn't see a difference between, let's say, like 5 RIR and going to failure. And I've written about that before. And I still think to some extent there's some validity to that, which I think we can discuss. But what's important is when you go and you do science and when you look at these analysis, you have no care level what the outcome is. I remember when Zach showed this to me, he said, I ran the analysis, here you go. I was like, no freaking way, man. No freaking way. Are you telling me the last 5 years of my life are just wrong, just completely wrong? And so I think that's important too. We didn't go into this necessarily with this opinion. If anything, I was pretty strong against this being the case. So just to kind of highlight all of those things for people that are listening and watching and reading this paper, I think there's some little details in there, and just to kind of understand what goes into an analysis like this and some of the calls you have to make, and you do the best you can, but it's impossible to be perfect with things. And the amount of work here was pretty tremendous.
Zach, I want to hop right back to you in a second, but Michael, sorry, I called you Mike before. I want you to clarify something. What exactly surprised you? What were some of the assumptions you had going into this when you said that Zach showed you some of those numbers? What were some of the prior assumptions? And what, when we talk about that directionality, like what shocked you? What surprised you?
Yeah. So, you know, I've been writing for a little while whenever I get a chance to write about proximity to failure, which is primarily in mass, that, you know, I'm of the opinion that you can train farther from failure than most people think and maximize hypertrophy. And so for me, while I've been hesitant to say exactly this far from failure, I generally say 4, 5, 6 RIR, something like that. In general, I would say you can train pretty far from failure and see substantial muscle growth, and perhaps just as much muscle growth as training close to failure or to failure. And we've seen some studies show this, right? There's a study from Carroll et al. That came out a few years ago. I think Greg reviewed in Mass. There's a study from a lab. I don't think any of us know how to say the name. Maybe Dr. Helms, maybe you can. Lesvicius et al. I'm not quite sure how to say the name. You have any clarity on that?
Lasavicius, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, and they're training up to maybe about 6 or 7 RIR if we would estimate in that study, and they saw similar growth. The Carroll study about 5 RIR, so similar growth to training to failure. There's a number of other studies, training not to failure, where you can see there's no significant difference between the groups or between the conditions. And so based upon that, and I've also looked at some other data, I've also kind of thought for a while that people tend to, when they tend to predict RIR, and they say they do a squat set at 70% of 1RM, let's say, and they do 8 reps, and they say, I had 2 more left. Well, the data shows that they tend to maybe have 4 or 5 more left, right? They tend to underpredict how much more they have. So I've theorized for a while that people are actually training a little bit farther from failure, at least on some of these major exercises, than they think. And so that to me has been a little bit of indirect evidence to supporting some of those other studies I just mentioned, to say, all right, you can probably train a little bit farther from failure and still maximize muscle growth. That's not me saying I think you should always train that way. It's just saying I think you can, right? And so when Zach showed me this analysis, and he showed me, and I saw the slope of the line, it's just like, no freaking way, man. No way. Let me think back. So I start going back, looking through the studies, start thinking about it, and say, how did I get that wrong? How was I that off base, right? Because we're seeing the trend of the line when it goes towards failure. And, you know, I think there's a lot more nuances to discuss. I think it certainly depends still on the frequency that you're training with, and how, if you're going to train to failure or not. It's going to depend perhaps on the exercise that you're using, whether it's free weights or machines. And I think there's things that can be maybe physiologically true, but impractical. And I think some of this is impractical in a lot of ways. If somebody were to say we're always trained to failure, it's also difficult to actually talk about the exact magnitude on an individual basis that someone may benefit from going to failure or going to a little bit closer to failure. So the short answer to your question, Omar, is I wouldn't have expected there'd be, let's say, such a steep slope, if you will, as one gets closer to failure with the relationship with muscle growth. I would have anticipated that the rate of growth from, let's say, 5 RIR and in was fairly similar. But it appears that I was wrong in that case. Now a lot of the attention here has been paid to hypertrophy. I think for strength, it's a different story. What's interesting is that's what Zach and I were primarily interested in at first, right? Neither one of us were bodybuilders, and we were interested in strength, and we started noticing, some of the velocity loss studies and things along those lines, and saying, oh, look, these 20% velocity loss groups, 15% velocity loss groups are gaining just as much strength as those that are going closer to failure. That seems probably a bit more beneficial. You're not going to get as much of an interconversion away from 2x fibers, and perhaps you're going to be a bit stronger. But then the project took on a life of its own and went to hypertrophy. So I wouldn't have expected, let's say, the quote unquote effective reps model to be supported to the extent it was. But I'm sure we'll get into this more later. I still think there's a lot of nuance to talk about surround that. But for anybody that's interested in getting into science, that's what it's all about, because you really have no care level what the outcome is. Now I just want to know more. Now I just want to see what I got wrong about it, or how this translates to practice, or does it translate to practice, which is a whole nother discussion.
Zach.
The only thing I was going to say is just to defend you a little bit, Dr. Zourdos. I think probably something that doesn't get talked about again and kind of the sound bites is I do think you are pretty accurate in your thinking initially with heavy loads. And I think that's the thing that probably goes under the radar a little bit, is that when we look at the interaction between RAR and load, which we can talk about more, it seems that the slope meaningfully comes down. Now, there's some kind of nuances to where I would consider that cutoff point of where, like, from a practical perspective, I'd say, okay, now you're good. But it's probably somewhere around like at 5 to 8 RM or heavier. So if I'm just thinking kind of off the top of my head of studies that are kind of in that window, it was somewhere, if I recall correctly, somewhere in like the 75 to 80% of 1 RM range. That's where it starts to get a little fuzzy, and then 80% and greater, it starts to get a little bit clearer that it doesn't matter as much for hypertrophy. If you think about all the studies you're kind of thinking about, like Santianello, some of the other studies, I think that kind of explains that a little bit. And there's kind of this interaction between the studies that we assign to, it doesn't seem to matter that much, and the ones that also use heavier loads. And that's where it gets tricky. And that's why this approach is useful, to kind of plot all those variables together and kind of look at things a little bit more systematically for that overall relationship. But I, like you said, I was very similar in kind of my thinking. I think this supports it in some ways, but changes my mind in others to some degree.
Yeah, and for those listening, like what Zach's referring to there specifically is, at let's say around, again, it's not an exact cutoff, but around 80% of 1 RM or so, the relationship for hypertrophy changes a little bit, and you maybe don't need to train, as close to failure. And what he's talking about in the Santianello study, the Levitius study that I mentioned earlier, those are within subjects design studies. Meaning one limb did one training, another limb did the other training. The Carroll was not a within subjects design study, but they were doing, that was from an ETSU. They were doing some main lifts. They were training with higher loads in that case. So over 8%, maybe it's not as big of a deal. It also matters why the RAR tends to decrease. Meaning, does it tend to decrease because somebody is fatiguing more with, let's say, a 65%, 70% of 1 RM? Maybe now they're recruiting more fast twitch muscle fibers as they get closer to failure? Or is it increasing because the load is so heavy, right? If you train at 90% of 1 RM, you're already at, 1-2 RIR after you do 1 rep. So I think all of those things are very important in the nuanced discussion. So, I appreciate you giving me a little bit of saving grace there on my original opinion from years ago. But nonetheless, with the moderate loads, it's still not exactly what I would have expected. But I do think that that's an important point Zach mentioned. And if you do go through the paper, it's extraordinarily long, and there's a lot of supplementary materials. What he talked about is in there. All of the moderators, which there's a very many, are in the paper and in the supplementary materials. So good luck if you can get to it. But that's why it's nice that we're on here. And thanks to these guys for giving us the platform, because it's a much more straightforward way to get some of it across, rather than say, hey, go read the 100-page text that's out there.
So yeah, it's our pleasure to host it. And one thing, we're spending a lot of time on the nuances of the analyses and their limitations, but I think one thing that is really important to also focus on is the strength of meta-analysis and some of the inherent statistical benefits that also help explain why one could have a hypothesis going into it, like you did, Mike, that wasn't matched by the findings. So I've talked about this before, but the majority of studies comparing lower to higher protein intakes and their effect on strength and hypertrophy have null findings, somewhere between 70 to 80% of them. However, when you look at the last 4 to 5 meta-analyses published since like 2018 by Morton and colleagues from then on, there's been many on both strength and hypertrophy, they consistently find a significant effect, and typically somewhere in what we would consider a moderate to high protein intake being better than lower. Depending on the type of analysis, it typically clusters around 1.5, 1.6 grams per kilogram of protein. But a lot of these individual studies are comparing like 1 to higher. There's a number of studies that have done in the 80s and 90s where, like, on bodybuilders, it's 1 or 1.2 grams per kg compared to 1.8 or 2 or higher, and they don't seem to find a significant difference. And it is a completely understandable thing. And most of the nutrition world viewed the necessity of high protein intakes as basically, that's not a thing. And you can find some very low recommendations from back in the day. And it wasn't until these more recent meta-analyses where you have the statistical power, where you can look at non-significant findings, where there's a mean difference favoring one group, and then collapse that into a larger meta-analysis, and you can actually see, because now you have the statistical power to do so, that is a consistent effect. That is not just variance, that's not just noise. And that's exactly what you guys did. So as much as I appreciate you discussing the potential noise and fuzziness, the very specific term that I used earlier related to the RIR estimations, I think it's also really important that the listener or the reader, if they do want to dive in, doesn't simply look at those limitations and use them as an excuse to dismiss the analysis, but also understands, this study, it might have actually been 3 RIR on average, but we counted it as 2 because of cumulative fatigue, or, we made some assumptions about the alternative set structure, or we made some assumptions about the relationship with velocity loss and RIR that don't hold true for most people. But when we have this many studies with participants in them, a lot of that does get taken care of purely by the amount of analysis that goes in and the sample size and the power being higher, so that on average, that probably is a correct estimate. And I think it does mean that we can have some confidence in this relationship. So I would say that, and I would also say, Dr. Zourdos, I think your interpretation does make a lot of sense, given you've always been strength focused, and most of the time we are looking at training with loads that are at that point where it probably matters a little bit less. So anyway, I thought those were important caveats just to add, so people understand not to dismiss the study because of its limitations, but actually to consider the fact that the robustness of the sample size of the number of studies in this meta-analysis should give us a little more confidence in at least the overall relationship, even if there is some variance in the individual points. So we've started to talk about them, but let's just not bury the lead here. Zach, what were the principal findings for hypertrophy, and what were the principal findings for strength? And then what was the best model fit? I noticed it seems like the kind of the 0 to 10 RIR seems to be the most robust analysis, if I recall correctly, for both. And then let's talk about some of the things that impact this relationship or these relationships with both strength and hypertrophy.
Absolutely. So let's start with hypertrophy. So the simplest way to kind of explain it, again, kind of fitting with all of the caveats that we mentioned, I would say the principle from all the models that we fit is that hypertrophy does tend to improve as you get closer to failure. The best fit model was one that improved non-linearly as we got closer to failure, meaning that you kind of have relatively consistent results till you reach closer to failure, somewhere in the 8 RIR range, and then things seem to accelerate a little bit. Now, just to hit on this one more time, because this seems to be a really sticky part of everything, I don't think we should hold to that very strongly. Like, again, there are so many different things that could influence that being the exact shape that's the quote unquote best fit. And I think a reasonable person could model this in a few different ways. I don't think there's a perfect way to do it and get a shape of the curve or shape of the dose response relationship that is slightly different. Somebody that really, really values model parsimony or simpler analyses could take the linear model and think that's the one that was generally the second best fit and use that as the one that they kind of base their conclusions upon. But nonetheless, all of them suggested that, again, from a directional perspective, outcomes seem to improve as we get closer to failure. Whereas strength, specifically the way that we modeled it, and an important caveat every time I talk about strength is at a given load, the relationship is basically flat. If you're being a little bit, literal, it declines a little bit as you get closer to failure. But overall, I would say it's a negligible relationship, meaning proximity to failure at a given load doesn't seem to drive strength gains reliably. So the two relationships definitely diverge, where proximity to failure does seem to be meaningfully influencing hypertrophy, but for strength, it doesn't when both of those predictions are made at a given load with some other statistical adjustments we can get into if we want. But those are the kind of the overarching findings for each of the two outcomes.
Awesome. So I think That makes a lot of sense to me, honestly. I think when you look at prior analyses of strength, you see that it is specificity that is going to be the principal driver, which another way to put that is the load on the bar. It is not necessary that you do, 10 reps with 75% of 1RM to get better at a 1RM. The fact is that you loaded 75% of your 1RM, that's probably going to influence you the most. And then, 85%. It's probably going to be a little more effective in a vacuum, which is a broad statement, but like I said, in a vacuum. And I think for hypertrophy, one thing I do want to point out, so like when you actually look at some of the figures in this analysis, is as much as this might be, and I mentioned this in the last podcast, a win for the crowd that goes, I really did think that training closer to failure is better for hypertrophy. And it's not just like, hey, once you're at 5 RIR, like Dr. Z might have mentioned, it's basically the same. Yeah, that seems to be the case, that there is this linear or even nonlinear, escalating relationship as you get closer to failure. But there is robust hypertrophy generated at 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, all the way through. When you look at the actual data, you do see an effect like training at a 10 RIR, which I think is hard for people to accept on average. Obviously, there's some like, training age, how much volume, et cetera, all matters. But do you want to talk about that, Zach, a little bit? Like, even though we're talking about the highest point estimate is at 0 RIR, that there is a positive point estimate all the way down at 7, 8, 9, and 10 RIR.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's a few things that go into that. Like, for example, I think the kind of the main effect predictions are occurring at like 70-ish% of 1RM. And so when you have a meta regression like this, you can make predictions out to infinite RIR, right? So there, to some degree, those aren't something we should just take at face value. And once you get to 40 RIR or whatever, we'll have a positive effect over 0 due to the way that the model worked there. But is that really something that we should hold to with a ton of confidence? Probably not. And if you look at the actual uncertainty intervals associated as you get farther from failure, they just keep escalating and get wider and wider and wider to demonstrate that those, as we get farther from failure, which is, as you pointed out, one of the reasons we did the sensitivity analysis with only studies less than 10 RIR, because there was just so much less data once we got past that point. So yeah, I think it is interesting though, like how, like you said, like there's still positive outcomes. And I think that points to me that while proximity to failure is important, it's probably not the only thing that matters. Obviously you could do, 40 sets a week at 15 RIR and probably see some sort of positive outcomes, which I think is very important to latch onto from a practical perspective, to say anyone that somehow is using this analysis to justify how to program every single training variable doesn't really make sense to me. But I've seen that a good amount. Unfortunately. So yeah, I think that is an interesting thing. And then the other thing that you guys said on the other episode of the podcast that I do think is important to keep in mind too is the effects we're dealing with aren't super large. So the accelerating effects that we're talking about closer to failure in the nonlinear model, which again, terms and conditions apply, as Dr. Pack would like to say, to that actual acceleration towards failure. The actual magnitude of the difference in the effect size is not massive by any means. And again, when you take into account the uncertainty intervals and how wide those are, understanding that the effect could truly be and kind of anywhere within that, I think you can have a little bit more of a tempered conclusion on how that actually informs training. The graph I thought would be helpful, but in hindsight, I think has been part of the misinterpretation, was where we plotted the strength and the hypertrophy results in kind of a summary graphic. And then on the y-axis was the proportion of the maximal effect size. That, I think, has led to some pretty counterintuitive thinking around this, where, you get to 3 RAR, let's say, and it's like 25% less of an effect size for hypertrophy, let's say. While that may be true in some sense, I don't think that's how I would necessarily view it, if that makes sense. Again, considering the uncertainty intervals, the error in estimation, and the best fit model and how that would look, et cetera. So there's just so many layers of nuance to start teasing out specific RARs. Like Dr. Zourdos said, I tried to, throughout the entire manuscript, not compare RARs, because I don't think that's how this should work. You're just looking at the directionality of that relationship and understanding that proximity to failure does seem to play a role for hypertrophy, to which the actual programming of the specific RARs is subject to all these different variables. But I think I took that on a tangent, so reel me back in if you have to.
No, I think if that was a tangent, it was a good one. And I think highlighting where people are making misinterpretations is important, because hopefully they will do less of that as they, listen to you talk about it in more depth. One thing I found really interesting, sticking with hypertrophy a little bit, is some of the moderator analyses. It seemed like basically anything reduced the importance of failure. Like anytime, like I actually got a little highlight here. So studies that were set volume equated, repetition volume equated, higher biological age, trained with multi-joint exercises, trained with single joint exercises, did not utilize progressive overload, included a failure definition, alternative set structures, higher frequency per muscle group, longer intervention duration, higher percentages of male participants, within participant designs, and a higher number of adjusted sets per week were all things that change the point estimate to making failure be less impactful, if you will, on muscle hypertrophy. So to me, when I read this, it just makes me realize that and want to highlight, and I actually did this in the upcoming MASS video that's going to come out on the 1st of July, that you don't get to just pull one lever in training. When you change volume, or when you change load, or when you change proximity to failure, it has an interdependent effect on these other things, and it might change what the optimal combination is for your given goal and circumstances. So simply thinking that, we have the Schoenfeld and the Basaval meta-analyses that say more volume is better, and they show, not that they're continuous from one to the other, that, hey, as we add sets, we get more hypertrophy. And now we got the meta-regressions by Robinson and colleagues that shows, as you get closer to failure, you get more hypertrophy. Therefore, I just need to do more volume to failure. When in fact, changing volume might change the relationship of failure to hypertrophy, and vice versa, and even changing exercises, changing load, all these things. So that is my interpretation, and there's more. There's also, in a different analysis, concurrent training interventions had an impact, or those that did not utilize maximal concentric intended velocity. So simply making sure that when you are 3R at a 3 RIR, that all of those reps up to that 3 RIR, you're pushing the bar as fast as possible, makes failure less important. Anyway, I guess what I want to point out is that failure doesn't occur in a vacuum, and that, like I said, we don't get to just pull one lever. And I want to get your take on that. What does it say to you that almost every moderator you included dampened the power of training closer to failure?
Yeah, so the first thing is that, some of the way that those effects are estimated is it decreases the number of observations in which those are occurring. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. But the overarching thing, like you said, I think is absolutely critical. And this is why I keep hammering home on, let's not get tied to the way this relationship looks, is that it's an unstable estimation. There are so many different things that, you could look at these relationships differently. And there's probably even more things that we could have, coded in our analysis and looked at more moderator analyses. I was already, my computer almost exploded when I was running the analysis with all the different ones that we already included. But there's probably more that we could even look at. But as you said, I think the critical thing here is that this is absolutely an unstable estimation in which all of these little different factors are going to influence the magnitude and the way that this curve looks. But to the one caveat I have with all those moderator analyses and why those are kind of supplementary components is that just the number of observations are different for those. And so that limits their power to some degree, just because they do have a different number of analyses, a different number of observations depending on the actual moderator that was included, and things like that. So those are a caveat for those, and the uncertainty intervals are generally way wider because of that, and some additional caveats. But ultimately, I think the take home there is that, man, this is a pretty sensitive estimation to all these little different things that we could include. Let's not take this to the bank and think this is absolutely holy grail of how proximity to failure influences hypertrophy, for example. So yeah, that's generally my thinking there. But on the other hand, strength, relatively stable. Very few moderators that influence strength. And I think that, again, it's been hilarious on social media. That was kind of what we sought out to do this for, and it has turned into the pro failure guy, ironically. So
yeah, I think that can kind of reveal that if somebody were to read this analysis and ask the question, which of these analyses can I feel more confident in, the hypertrophy analysis or the strength analysis? I would say it's the strength analysis, and it's really not particularly close. It doesn't mean that analysis is, that we'll never, no meta-analysis will ever find anything different. I don't know that. But based upon what it seems to be affecting, or the moderators, as you guys pointed out, that seem to be affecting that relationship, strength is a much more stable analysis. And I like the word Zach used, unstable, to describe the hypertrophy analysis. And because of those things interact, I think I've said before in the lab a few times recently, Zach, the question that I'm interested in the future is, which we just simply cannot know from this, right? We avoided this. All right, so let's say for the sake of argument that the relationship is accurate, right? And I think for anybody that is listening or watching this, you have a scientist who did the analysis telling you that he's unsure if this is going to hold up over the long term, right? And that's pretty cool, right? That's really how that should go and how that should work, especially when something as exploratory as this was. And so the question that I'm interested in is, all right, so let's say for the sake of argument that yes, you see this, and training to failure, or even training past failure, momentary muscular failure, is better than volitional failure, which is better than a 1 RIR, which is better than a 2 RIR. But because, as Dr. Helm stated, you have that interaction of all of those variables, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's just one thing that affects muscle growth. So theoretically then, training at a 1 RIR could be just as good for muscle growth as training to failure if you adjust those other variables appropriately that factor for hypertrophy. Let's just use volume because that's the big one, right? And the easiest one to kind of discuss. So how many more sets, right? What's the simple slope of the relationship between the change in RIR and the change in sets needed to compensate for the lost hypertrophy from going to a 0 to a 1 RIR? Let's say you get this much growth training to a 0 RIR, and you get this much growth training to a 1 RIR. Well, what's the change in sets? Well, now let's say maybe that change in sets, you need 0.6 more sets. Well, then for 2 RIR, maybe if it's a linear relationship, maybe you need 1.2 more sets. It's probably not linear, but you get the point. If it's a 3 RIR, you get 1.8 more sets, right? So I don't know what that answer is. I don't know if that is a thing that exists. I suspect that it probably does. But I think that's a very important point, not to mention frequency. And as we all kind of mused earlier before recording, the number of studies on failure training versus non-failure training with the high frequency are very, very small. And so, if somebody were to train a muscle group 5-6 days a week, some sort of volume cycling type of program, I think this is something that somebody can do. I've made a video on this before and talked about this quite a bit, but I don't think that you're going to do that effectively by training to failure. And so you're probably going to need to stay shy of failure. Then with that extra volume and extra frequency, perhaps compensate more than even training to failure for muscle growth. I don't know the answer to that. I think another question is here, we talk about individualization so much, and I'll bring this back around in a second. But if we look at some of the studies, I think this is a study from Anglari looking at pyramid type training, rest pause type training, drop set type training, showing that there may not be a difference in these training types on a group level or even within subject, but on an individual level, somebody may grow when looking at the within subject design more from rest pause training or drop set training than traditional training, but on a group level or across population, there's no difference between the training types. Well, why is that the case? Well, one reason it may be the case is if we think of the mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy, metabolic stress being one, metabolic stress may be more prevalent of a mechanism for some than for others. So those that are training to failure, maybe they're benefiting from one mechanism of muscle hypertrophy more than others that are training to failure. So if somebody's out there saying, well, I know this guy or this person, or I train to failure and I'm seeing great progress, or somebody saying, I don't train to failure and I'm seeing awesome progress. Both are probably true, right? For one reason or another, how those other variables are being manipulated. You may be growing more from one way of training versus another, or mechanistically, this one style may fit you better than may fit another person. And so you may be growing from that style of training. Not to mention, as was said earlier, that the magnitude of difference in growth that we're talking about is quite small. And so if you're training, even if training to failure is, let's say, optimal for you, and you've been training a 3 to 4 RAR and you've been growing a lot, that's also not surprising. So, there's so many things that interact and there's so many things that go into it. And there's just so many things that we don't know and we can't know because when we set out to do an analysis, you answer a very specific question. And we did the best we can to answer that question. But all it does is really provoke more questions. How do I put this into practice? All right, well, I'm going to train with a 2 RAR rather than training to failure. How much more volume do I need to add, or how many more sets do I need to add to compensate for the lost growth of training at a 2 RAR versus 0 RAR? Then perhaps by doing that, I still recover a bit more quickly. Then I can train again more frequently. And now maybe I've gotten even more volume and more growth over time. So I think that was actually a tangent, unlike Zach's last one. But there's so many interactions that can go into that. And then a side note, Zach, if you want, we can get back to, if these fellas are okay with it, the fatigue component for failure versus non-failure, and if that is a thing after the first week or so of training.
Yeah, I'll swing back to the volume stuff a little bit, just because I think that is pretty darn important for this. So I guess the first thing
it's
I'll
also
say
what
is,
everyone wants to know.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. Yeah.
To be clear, that I think, just to speak to this directly, the current meme of what the evidence-based community thinks is that volume is the principal variable that we can leverage to enhance hypertrophy. A higher set volume is going to be the largest predictor of muscle growth.
Yep.
So doing sets closer to failure may dampen my ability to do more sets, or may lower the loads of the reps I can do with them. So how does this interact? And does this analysis take into account volume? I think that's where a lot of the confusion and kind of being up in arms are, because the misinterpretation is that this analysis suggests that being closer to failure is the most important variable, not volume. Yep. And that's not a question that came up in this meta-analysis.
Correct.
And kind of getting to Dr. Zourdos' point, we don't know the answer to the optimization game, which ultimately this is would it be better for me to do more sets further from failure, or would it be better for me to do fewer sets closer to failure? And again, like I said, because of all these moderators, what we probably shouldn't say is, how about both? More sets closer to failure, because we don't actually know how that interaction plays out, but we know there's an interaction. So let's speak to that directly, Zach, and how would you deal with that kettle of fish?
100%. Yeah, this is I think this is the crux of both the misinterpretations that I've seen, and also from the practical perspective, what's the most interesting to me. So to speak to the analysis a little bit, for I'm not entirely sure why, but there has been some thinking that the analysis doesn't account for volume in any way, or speaks to the fact that volume doesn't matter. Proximity to failure is the only thing that matters, and that is completely independent of volume. That isn't quite accurate on a few different levels. The first thing I'll say from the main analysis, what we did was we included a variable that separated studies into two different kind of main cohorts, those that were set equated and those that were repetition equated. The idea there was, when you change proximity to failure in set equated studies, you're changing two things. And this is really my main critique of velocity loss studies in the hypertrophy realm, is that unfortunately, velocity loss influences proximity to failure, but also relative volume load, meaning you are kind of changing two levers. So we can't really say, does proximity to failure have an independent effect on hypertrophy regardless of training volume? And if you kind of look
really
at
quick so that people understand, if you do the same load, we're both training with 75%, one group does 40% velocity loss, one group does 20% velocity loss, both group does 4 sets, you're thinking, okay, same volume, they both did 4 sets, 75% on 1 RM, but they just trained different proximities to failure. Well, yeah, set volume is the same, but they probably did on average half as many reps in the group that did a 20% velocity loss. So yes, we focus on set volume these days, but as a heuristic, it's not to say that total volume, total reps has no bearing on hypertrophy. So there is an issue there. So you do have to decide, when you do a study on failure, do I have one group do as many reps with lower loads and then stop and just be at a higher RIR, or do I have them use the same load and the same number of sets, but actually do fewer reps per set. And because you can't have it both ways. So I think that's just to give some explanation of what you're saying. Carry on.
100%. And I think a couple more points of why that isn't a super fair comparison is theoretically, if the sets were equated and the loads were low enough that they're both lifting over, the number is kind of fuzzy in my mind, but around 5 or 6 reps or so, then those sets are kind of on even playing field. But the other assumption that comes into counting those sets is proximity to failure. So it's kind of tautological in the sense that we are looking at proximity to failure in set equated studies, but assuming that proximity to failure needs to be sufficient to count the sets. So it's that whole concept is kind of difficult. So the point being, when you separate those two things, it's important to look at those because the influence of additional repetitions is also kind of in this bucket of set equated studies. When we do that, there wasn't a quote, in traditional analysis, it wouldn't have been significant, but the slope definitely was decreased in magnitude for set equated studies for repetition equated studies in comparison to set equated studies, which hints that while volume load doesn't seem to completely change the directionality of the relationship, it is marginally dampened when you do equate for the differences in volume load. So right off the bat, volume matters there. The second thing is when we do the additional moderator analyses, when we looked at the interaction between RAR and a metric we called adjusted sets per week, and just to explain what that was real quick, coming back to the alternative set structure research, you will recall that we estimated the RAR from each quote unquote mini set that for the cluster groups of the rest redistribution group. But we didn't want to count sets that way. That doesn't really make sense. We don't want one group doing 40 sets of one and counting that as 40 sets per muscle group. So what we did was taking the alternative set structure groups and equated the number of sets to the traditional group in that study to kind of make that a little bit more of a realistic variable. So when you include that interaction with RAR, the overall relationship doesn't seem to change dramatically, but higher volumes do seem to dampen the effect a little bit. Now, I've played around with this sense a little bit more of the uproar. Depending on how you model it, it can be the degree in which it dampens can change a little bit. But the way that we did it in the preprint itself, the higher volume conditions do seem to dampen the relationship quite a bit, I would say, to the extent that it was a meaningful moderator for hypertrophy. So what that means is higher volumes can kind of compensate for training closer to failure, which is an obvious point. So for, again, just to be crystal clear, the analysis in no way says that volume doesn't matter. If anything, it is quite literally the opposite. So that just to make that crystal clear. But coming back to your question, Eric, that I think honestly is the one that I have for you guys for feedback and thinking is the optimization problem is the exact way that I frame it in my head as well. So we have these different levers that we can pull. There's different combinations that we can have to have a given training stress, and we assume that's going to lead to adaptations resultant from that training stress. If we take some liberties and take the slopes reported from the Schoenfeld volume meta-analysis and the linear slopes from our meta-analysis, so trying to keep everything on kind of an even playing field, I would have to go back and double check. But I think what that leads to from like a comparison perspective is if you were to do 8 sets per muscle group in a week to failure, it's approximately 16 sets per week at 3 RAR would relatively equate the outcomes. To me, that seems in the ballpark of reasonable, of what I think is kind of a reasonable approximation. Now, to be very clear, that I would not run with that to the bank. There's quite a few limitations to kind of comparing slopes that way, one of which that the volume meta-analysis from Schoenfeld is missing quite a few studies that we have now, so the degree to which that kind of continues, especially to higher volumes, is all subject to interpretation. But nonetheless, that gives us kind of a relatively practical point to kind of think about it. And I think, to me, again, that kind of passes the face validity test of what I think kind of the proponents of a lower volume paradigm training very closer to failure versus more of the kind of the sub-maximal RAR approaches. That kind of seems like a reasonable comparison to me. But ultimately, that is the line of direct research I think we're headed towards. Instead of volume equated conditions that are very strictly set up to answer questions that obviously could still use more investigation. But to me, what's become a little bit more interesting with our analysis and thinking about the interaction with volume is how do we play this optimization game? What is the prioritizing factor? You could look at the slopes directly, and the change in effect size you get from one RAR seems to be stronger than you get from one set. But I don't think that you can really justify that as criteria to say RIR is more important. That concept doesn't really make sense to me personally. So to me, the more interesting question is, okay, let's kind of play the optimization game in kind of both realms, actually do a few studies that very well define, report, and control RIR in kind of these more archetypal investigations rather than directly controlling the number of sets and manipulating RIR in a different fashion. So I guess my question to you guys is kind of hearing that rough kind of approximation. Does that pass the face validity test? Do you think that's outrageous? Any thoughts?
I think it actually bridges to something that is a really important caveat to not just the research on failure, but also all the research on resistance training, is that we're operating within some constraints that are meaningfully different, that I would guess are meaningfully different. Let's say they are different in terms of the actual the way training is structured, and may have a meaningful impact on the constraints of what we can talk about. And that is how much time people spend training and training studies, and the total volumes they're doing. So there's, your figure 1 from your paper, I think it's not just a descriptive kind of thing like, hey, here's what we assessed. It should help people understand the context in which you can make conclusions about this analysis. So a parallel is that earlier Dr. Zourdos was talking about how he thinks people underestimate the proximity to failure, which is true. So instead of making a statement about proximity to failure of, hey, 2 RIR and 3 and 4 RIR probably provide equivalent results, the actual statement would be an intended 4, 3, and 2 RIR produces this. So I think the way we need to look at this analysis, for example, looking at that RIR, is that regardless of what the actual RIR was, we estimated it, right? In some cases, it probably was pretty accurate based on velocity. But in many cases, it was a reported RIR or an estimated RIR from what people thought. So that means that while we can't make a statement about the actual true RIR that each individual reached, we know that an intended 10 RIR all the way to an intended 0 RIR has this relationship. And then going back to what I was saying about figure 1, we know that is true in the context of the studies that have been conducted and meta-analyzed. And an important point about them, the vast majority of them, 70, 80% of them, were doing between 4 to 10 sets per muscle group, right, when you did the adjusted sets.
The only caveat there that's a little bit counterintuitive, that's only direct sets. That's the only thing that makes those numbers seem a little bit lower than, I would say, just the way that volume is typically analyzed. So that's one additional caveat that I don't know if is very clear now that I think about the preprint, but that's just one thing I want to say.
It is important, and I did not pick up on that. So I think that might be worth a minor adjustment when you guys go to if you can sneak that at a peer review. So I think, so even bumping that up a little bit, I would say we're largely looking at what we would consider low to moderate volumes, right? Moderate, low to maybe moderate volumes. The other thing I would say is that the vast majority of studies also had a frequency of training each muscle group twice per week. And the actual number of sessions in the gym, 90% of the studies are 3 times per week or less, with some being a few more. So I think the optimization problem is one we can only answer within that context if we're going to use exclusively the research. I think as soon as you start going, well, what if people were willing to train 5 or 6 days a week, which, by the way, 70% or ish of bodybuilders do. In fact, one survey of bodybuilders showed that all of them trained 5 to 6 days per week. So I don't think that's true, just because I live in the real world and I've met plenty of bodybuilders who train 3 and 4 times a week. But I would say probably the majority, if like the mode of bodybuilders, competitive bodybuilders, people interested in it, it's probably 5 times a week for how many days a week they train. So the fact that there is not, and maybe there's one, I don't know, but there's basically that the majority of ways that people train in the real world is completely unrepresented by the research. I think we can't know if the optimization problem would be the same. But I think it does pass face validity in the context of what we have researched. But just given that we know that there's interactions between volume, load, exercise selection, and that there's a fatigue effect, which Dr. Z was talking a bit about going to failure, that may be less of an issue with lower volumes and less frequency, that is it possible that we could go down this rabbit hole all the way and try to figure out what is the optimal combination, but that is only true if you're training 3 days a week or less, and it becomes a different calculus once you're training more frequently. So I just think that's an important point to consider, but I do agree that passed the sniff test, if you will.
Interesting. Dr. Zourdos, you got some?
Yeah, just one thing, to keep with the appropriate formality theme today for, Dr. Helms, although Zach certainly wasn't doing that. Just, he's in the lab the other day, Eric this and Eric that. I think Josh and Jake were being super respectful. Dr. Helms, Dr. Trexler, they're that sort of thing. And you're just over there, just, Eric, like he's going to text you, like he would never do that. But it's fine. I'll keep it together for us. But you're talking about the broader issue with this and resistance training research. And so under this certain context, this is what we have, but the interaction of these other variables, and we don't know what happens. So this is why, and, I think of a lot of other types of, research in this discipline. So I think of some of the really, really high volume studies, and people will see these and run with these right away and say, all right, 35, 40, 45 sets per week. I'm going to go ahead and do that because that had a little bit better growth. Well, it had a little bit better growth in the population tested for that specific muscle group over a very short period of time, maybe 6 weeks or so. That doesn't mean that you should shoot for that type of volume and consistently utilize that type of volume forever and ever into the end of time. What that's demonstrating is conceptually, this was probably a huge increase in volume from what people were doing before. In that case, it's advocating for an overreach or for a volume cycling type of phase. For 6 weeks, you could maybe see a little bit more growth in this specific muscle group. And those studies don't show greater growth in all muscle groups tested, by the way, over that short period of time. And then you'd probably want to cycle off of it. And just practically, if you're doing that for the upper body, you're not going to be able to maintain then another 45 sets for the lower body probably per week. So under those very specific circumstances and all of the other factors and the frequency and the proximity to failure that go along with it, those individuals are seeing that response. But what that is a concept. It's saying conceptually, this can work. Now, as a practitioner, as a coach and a lifter, you need to fit that into the program and use it in the appropriate place in that program to facilitate growth or strength gains, adaptations for this individual. Similar to what we're talking about here, if somebody were to say, all right, perhaps with a little bit of lower volume, now I train to failure, and maybe that's a little bit more beneficial. So let's put these two concepts together. Let's integrate them and say, all right, I'm going to utilize some really high volume on chest, shoulders, triceps, these upper body movements. And so I'm going to train them a bit more frequently, maybe 3, 4, even 5 days a week. And I'm going to hammer those home for 4, 5, 6 weeks overreach. On the lower body now, I'm only going to be performing maybe, 10 sets of quad training per week. And I'm only going to be training those quads twice per week during the 6 weeks when I'm doing all this other volume on all these movements. But those 10 sets I'm going to take to failure, or I'm going to be real sure I'm close to it, because under these circumstances now, that's where I'm benefiting. And so that's how you can put together a program and kind of integrate these concepts together. And not everything is static over time, right? And so when we throw out these numbers, this many sets per week of volume or whatever it might be, or even more important, let's say, running this many miles a week, if we really want to talk about what's important, right? You would utilize, nobody laughed at that. Not one person took Eric just a second and then he caught on, right? But under these circumstances, when you integrate those things together, you say, all right, I'm going to use this volume cycling approach on these muscle groups. I'm going to keep that volume really, really high because in this short-term study, it showed a benefit, knowing you're not going to be able to sustain that forever. But because you're spending so much time and effort on this and the fatigue level from that, this other muscle group, I'm going to be training with a bit less volume. But that's my time where I'm really going to take those sets to failure because there's only a few of them. And then perhaps you're bringing these volumes back more even. And then you're overreaching maybe now on the lower body. you're training that a bit more frequently. In the upper body, you have a bit fewer sets here, and now you're taking those to failure. So you can be sure you're getting the most out of those sets if we agree with this model. So that's my lesson today, and kind of integrating these concepts together, which, just taking Eric's point of understanding the broader issue. Whenever you read a research study, you're getting the concept. That's all you're doing. You're getting the concept, and then you're figuring out how to integrate this in. A researcher's job or a scientist's job isn't necessarily to tell you how to train. It's actually not at all really how to tell you how to train, right? It's to answer that specific question under those very specific circumstances, right? And then places like this podcast and others, I mean, not other podcasts, of course, but, other mediums, right? To be able to understand those concepts and discuss, and the reader to be able to decide for themselves how to put it into practice. So anyways, I hope that example of the volume literature and volume cycling, and then how you would utilize failure training, those concepts makes sense. And that's tends to be how I try to look at research most of the time when I'm thinking about it these days.
I guess one follow-up I have on that I'm interested to see what you guys think. So kind of some of the concept that Dr. Zourdos is mentioning there is that, and what Dr. Helms said earlier, was these studies operate in a vacuum, like you said, and to some degree we have this body of research that we're extrapolating principles from that, again, when you run a regression, you could get, effects that go all the way up to 100 sets per week, but we're never going to have a study that looks at that. So to some degree, you're limited by the tools in which we operate from. But I guess one of the most interesting things that I've seen discussed on this, that I don't want to say I've rethought my position on, but I think I've become more agnostic on, is kind of the sustainability of this. I think I would probably have taken the position that, we have these acute studies on failure. Failure very consistently leads to a variety of different fatiguing indices that suggest it's considerably more fatiguing. Thus, the cost may not be worth it if the longitudinal outcomes are the same, basically. Throw in the fact that in the real world, things aren't volume equated. If I'm less fatigued, I can add more volume, do more frequency, etc. To some degree, because the directionality of the effects here does seem to suggest that training closer to failure at least has some benefit. Once again, all the caveats applied there of the degree to which that's true, but the directionality seems to suggest that, at least to some degree, has made me reevaluate, okay, to have a proper optimization problem, you need to understand both the costs and the benefits. And understanding the costs here is a crucial component of it. And I think it gets really easy to just accept the premise that failure is way more fatiguing. But if you really have the same epistemic standard in which you're operating from a research perspective that we use for everything else, I don't know if I would be as strong about that claim as I would have, a couple months ago. So, you think about what we base those opinions on. Pretty much every single fatigue study that we have is acute. So whether that's 1 or 2 visits, a crossover design, whatever. There is one published study that I'm aware of, and one unpublished study, which is my thesis, that looks at longitudinal aspects of fatigue in relation to proximity to failure. The only published study that I'm aware of is the male and female velocity loss study by, I'm not going to even try to pronounce the last name, I'll butcher it, but there's a longitudinal paper that shows strength and hypertrophy outcomes, and then there's one that looks at the acute bouts of fatigue after the 8-week training period. And there does seem to be some sort of adaptation occurring at higher velocity loss thresholds, which to some degree at least opens our eyes to the fact that we can adapt to this over time. Throw in the fact that we do have tons of bodybuilders, even strength athletes, that train in this way and seemingly are not wrecked for their entire day after a training session. It's at least conceivable that we can adapt to this, and maybe the fatiguing aspects of it, I don't want to say are overblown, but maybe overemphasized. And I think the key aspect of this that I don't have a good answer to, and I haven't thought through it enough, is I think there is a very big difference between performance decrements and actually changing the ability to benefit from a set. So failure is going to very reliably result in performance decrements, resulting in you having to drop the load to maintain a given repetition range, or at a sustained load, drop the repetition range to maintain a given RIR. that's going to happen, and that's going to be very consistent, I would say, regardless of when you're doing it. But I don't think that suggests, at least from like a logical perspective, to say that just because we're decreasing our performance, that immediately that set becomes less productive. There's probably a threshold just from a feasibility perspective in which that's true. If I have to reduce the load by 75%, I'm probably, spitting in the bucket at that point and not getting a ton out of that. But, within a reasonable range of performance decrement within a session, I don't know if that automatically suggests that that's a bad thing. And I think that's important, because if it's not, then we can consider some of these other optimization variables to kind of support not making the performance decrement as much of an issue, and just can make that a little bit more of an interesting of a conversation, because I think that was kind of the talking points for me, right? You have longitudinal studies don't seem to suggest there's a meaningful benefit in terms of outcomes of training all the way to failure. It's more fatiguing. Cost and benefits both suggest why do it. Try to support that additional fatigue budget for higher volumes, higher frequencies, et cetera. But now, if we take the premise and you kind of take all the lines that lead up to our analysis and agree with the subjectivities that go into it, and you accept there may be a little bit of a benefit to doing that, let's reevaluate the costs and have a similar episodic standard to which we're evaluating the evidence related to that. Because if we had any other supplement, any other training variable, any other thing where we had entirely acute evidence and 2 longitudinal studies, we would say we don't know anything. So I think that's the kind of the same thing here that I think about that is interesting in this conversation. That said, obviously, if I take my researcher hat and put my coaching hat on, if you do a set to failure, it's a very different experience to even terminating a set at 3 RAR. The point is, there's a lot of different variables that we could change, though, to make that cost theoretically less. Increase the loading range to the extent it's, the highest that is still counting for a set or what have you. Manipulate rest intervals, exercise selection, things like that you can do to make it so that you're able to achieve the neuromuscular qualia or what have you, getting closer to failure without all of these excessive things that don't seem to drive the process, but also may not hurt it that much. We really don't know. That is just a running thought in my brain that you guys could tell me if I'm crazy, but I just have, I've thought more about that since this, and I don't know if it's as straightforward, at least from a research perspective, if that's what we're using to justify things as I once thought.
I think it makes a lot of sense. And the simplest way that I would put this is, Zach's really referring to the repeated bout effect for failure training, right? And so the repeated bout effect is just as it sounds for those not familiar with the terminology, which is that when you repeat a bout of exercise, it becomes less damaging. So if you don't go to the gym for a while and you just go and you lift, you're pretty sore, 24, 48, 72 hours later. You go in the next week, you do the same workout, you're not as sore. The week after that, you're okay, right? And you can keep training. Well, what Zach's talking about is these acute studies. They're typical muscle damage studies, performing some sets to failure. Eric, you reviewed one of them, Miranda Navarro, some years back. I reviewed another one from Pereira Blanco. I believe there's another from Gonzalez Badillo. And individuals will do a training session to failure, maybe a training session not to failure, a couple different conditions, measure the responses of muscle damage markers in the blood, isometric strength, maybe vertical jump, velocity at a submaximal load, all these things before and after the damaging session to failure and not failure on Monday. And then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, test all of those things again. Look at the recovery time. The recovery time is faster in the individuals when they do not train to failure. So that makes a lot of sense, but these are only 1 week studies, as Zach is pointing out. So over time, does that actually matter? Is there actually a difference in the recovery time when somebody can come back and train again? Just because you can come back and train again doesn't mean you should or doesn't mean you need to, but is there the repeated bout effect for those markers of muscle damage and so forth? There probably is. And Zach, you did look at this. And what was interesting is this was the question I was most interested in your thesis many years ago now when we kind of started this process. And so I think that there probably is in that case. Now, again, and Zach alluded to this too, if that repeated bout effect does occur and the difference in the time course of recovery by those metrics I mentioned is not different, that's not necessarily accounting for everything, for all factors of fatigue and so forth, and just the acute stress or just the mental fortitude to continue to train to failure. Of course, the exercise selection and so forth, as Zach mentioned too. But I do think that I would take this similar opinion as him, and that it probably has been overblown, and I probably was too far on one side of it a few years back when seeing that data. But again, that's the disconnect between acute and longitudinal studies, right? You need that data. The one thing we've each mentioned in your thesis, Zach. Zach's thesis does not agree with the findings of the meta-analysis. I think that's interesting. So somebody could find that while it's not published in a journal yet. It is up on Google Scholar because it was a thesis at a university, so somebody could go ahead and find it. But I think that's interesting as well. Now, those are pretty unclear findings, if you will, based upon the sample size and the statistics around. Zach's nodding. He was about to chime in and correct me. But I think that's interesting too, is there are a lot of individual studies that disagree with that. So I do think one of the next things too is that repeated bout effect of failure training. Does that manifest over time? And based upon the other repeated bout effect literature we have, I think it probably does.
Eric.
Ultimately, what we're looking at here is if we would expect the fatigue, acute fatigue, which has been well documented from failure to negatively impact adaptation, that should show up in the literature, right? And the one piece of caution goes back to what I said earlier, is that it may not show up when people are training 2 or 3 times per week, which is the majority of the research on failure, could possibly in the real world. But of course, we are adapting to it. One thing I will say, though, is between this analysis, guys, that you've done, as well as the last 3 or 4 on frequency for both strength and hypertrophy, that indicate that frequency is actually not an independent positive driver, or at least not a meaningful one, for enhancing strength or hypertrophy, but rather it is the effect of higher frequencies typically having higher volumes that I think has vindicated the typical bro split. And I don't think that it's an accident that bodybuilders have typically fallen on 1 to 2 times per week muscle group based split training, where they do a moderate amount of volume or high, depending on their paradigm of training, in that individual session, primarily to failure, and they give themselves at least 3 or 4 days, if not 7 days, before they then train those muscle groups again. And I think, prior to these more recent meta-analyses, people were in the evidence-based community kind of poo-pooing that approach. But it seems like that is certainly within the realm of what could be optimal, or close enough to it that it doesn't matter. The real question is, okay, if we're going to put on the table training 6 days a week, or even doing 2-a-days and stopping short of failure to try to get more volume, does that end up being a better optimization than doing fewer? And what do people like to fall on? And I think there's also some big cultural influences there, because not training to failure is something that I think is mentally challenging for a lot of people. And finally, to your point, and this is, I think, an important moderator to bring up, Zach, is that while it may impact performance, it might not impact hypertrophy. And that's kind of what was shown in your analyses for strength. Like when you look at so for those who didn't catch it, there's basically no impact of going to failure or not for strength. It very slightly seems to be a little worse going to failure than not, but the effect isn't meaningful until there are certain moderators that are analyzed. And one of them was like multi-joint movements, or if impacting the legs, lower body training, or studies that were both set and repetition volume equated. So this kind of says like, hey, like it's probably better to do 5x3 on squats if you're training at a high load near to failure than it is to do 3x5 and actually push each one of those sets of 5 to failure, because it will negatively impact strength in these studies to a going from negligible to actually a meaningful degree based upon this moderator analysis. And I think that's pretty intuitive when we think about real world experiences of powerlifters. And also when we're looking at 6 to 12 week studies on strength, we're kind of just looking at acute performance in the grand scheme of things. That's not, I mean, it is a longitudinal adaptation, but it's limited to the length of these studies. So I think everything you guys are saying is actually supported by your analyses. So Zach, I would agree with you. Now, one thing I will say is we've been at it for a couple hours. We do need to wrap up, but I want to open the floor to you both. Are there any final points or clarifications you want to make about this paper before we finish this podcast, because you guys have done a great job thus far, and I want to make sure you get to say everything that you wanted.
Yeah, I think ultimately the thing I just want to get across is just the degree of uncertainty that should be appreciated with what we've done here. So as we've discussed, there's multiple levels of things that need to kind of be appreciated to clarify the statements that ultimately come in the conclusion sections of the paper, right? We started off with an exploratory analysis, which needs to be appreciated, not pre-registered. We kind of had a question that we wanted to look at and forego some of the more systematic processes of searching for studies, et cetera. I think we did a relatively broad scope and get all the studies that would apply for the analysis, but nonetheless, I'd be remiss not to mention that as far as a formal scientific process, we didn't do a systematic review, didn't do any of those things, so this should be treated as exploratory and through that lens first and foremost. Still a preprint, obviously things to change with the peer review process and some of the finer details of, again, the subjectivities and model fitting, all those things that could be, minorly changed as we go through the review process. The RER estimation procedure, again, that is the thing that needs to be appreciated the most, and how many decisions and ultimately compromises we needed to make to be able to perform this analysis in the first place. Thus, a reasonable person could not agree with the premises associated with the RER estimation process, and I don't want to say dismiss the analysis, but to some degree, not agree with it. And that's totally reasonable. You have to kind of get on board with the way that we did things. Now, that said, as you said earlier, I think they're pretty good. I think the way that we went about it was as systematic and as appropriate as we possibly could, given all the limitations associated with it. And I think it passes the face validity test for pretty much all of them. But nonetheless, you have to agree with those to even get into the findings, right? So the RER estimation procedure needs to be appreciated. The next thing is, again, not over-interpreting the results and saying this is exactly how the relationship looks. There are tons of subjectivities that go into this and the way that these models are fit, appropriate structuring and analyzing the data for a meta-regression of within-group effects that take a ton of care to make sure those are not going to lead you to spurious conclusions in comparison to a between-group meta-analysis where those comparisons are made directly at the study level. We took all of those procedures and tried to have as much care as possible. But again, there's a ton of ways you could go about modeling this that ours is not the end-all be-all approach. And finally, the way to interpret the actual results, look at the uncertainty intervals, understand that there's a lot of instability that comes in these estimated effects. And things could dip and dive in different ways as we get more data, as we get more accurate RER estimations. An author could look at their RER estimation and be like, hey, that's not what happened in our study. And that's totally possible based on the way that this had to operate. So there's tons of different levels that could minorly change the relationship. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the takeaway that I would have from a practical perspective is these are kind of the overall directional effects of proximity to failure and their relationship to these adaptations, to which the cornucopia of different coaching strategies can be opened up and have those optimization problems to apply to not only a given population, like you were mentioning, Dr. Helms, elite bodybuilders that train 5 times per week and are performing a full body split where you're hitting every single muscle group every single day. That's never been investigated, and that could be completely different than what we found. That's totally possible. And so the results need to be appropriately contextualized to the population in which you're actually trying to apply the results to, let alone the length of the interventions, all the different particulars of, do we value volume more? Do we value proximity to failure more? Is that individual? All those things. So at the end of the day, the way that I view this is it gives us a principle to operate from and at least an objective sort of relationship to which we can use our subjective lens, coaching eye, athlete kind of experience to then pull the levers of training that all matter. And this does not say that proximity to failure is the most important, the least important. It's agnostic to that question. That ability to pull the levers and have the optimization problem on the individual level is totally going to be a subjective kind of process that takes your personal experience into account and your interpretation of the research that is also going to be biased by your subjective experience. So there's tons of different levels that are going to actually influence the RER they're going to write down on the piece of paper, but hopefully this can give us some sort of framework to operate that decision-making process from and the overall directionality of the effects for the different adaptations.
Love it. Really appreciate that summary, Zach.
Yeah, fantastic summary. I'm not going to add to that. I just want to take my minute and just highlight Zach's work, not only on this project, but everything that he's been doing for the past few years here in our lab, along with Josh Pelland and Jake Remmert, who's just published a couple first author RER accuracy papers. He's really becoming quite knowledgeable on that. And just want to highlight, those PhD students and what they're doing in the lab. Really proud of their work, proud of the effort that they put in. And, there's a lot of people out there listening to this now that are doing masters and are doing PhDs. And that's a result of what's happened in the industry over the past decade or so or more. And that's really a very cool thing. And so they know the kind of work that these people do and these students do on a daily basis. And, nobody's watching. They're given a set of instructions, and a lot of times they're just independent. They're coming up with stuff on their own, and then they're coming back and saying, "Hey, I worked on this," or we're and so forth. And I'm just really proud of the effort they put in. They make my job easy. The amount of time and effort, and just how far they've exceeded myself and so many of their capabilities. So just want to highlight those three PhD students. Zach, of course, being one of them, and the most senior PhD student in the lab, who's doing just so much on a daily basis right now. I really difficult to articulate how much he does, how capable he is, and how proud I am of the work that he's doing and his colleagues are doing. So great stuff, man. Keep it up. And, hopefully we can edit that part out and nobody will know I said such nice things.
Thank you,
Eric.
Omar.
I'm aware of your time. I think you guys did a phenomenal job. I'm sure this will spur even more conversations. I cannot wait, Zach, to see how this is improperly digested in the greater space. I thought you did an excellent job, very lucid. We'll have all the show notes down in the description. Also cannot wait until you rebrand from data-driven strength, Zach from data-driven strength, to Zach from data-driven hypertrophy, because that's now where all the juice will be had. So
absolutely.
We'll get Kai to change the links in the description. But, Michael Zourdos, always great to have you back on. Can't wait to have you back on for the X time. I want to say it's like 4th, 5th, or 6th. It's something.
So many. It's so many. I appreciate the time as always. Always an honor to be here. I'm just gonna call it 10. I think it's my 10th. 10th
Just round up. Just round up.
I'm just gonna go with that. But thanks, guys. We really do appreciate it.
Yeah, you have the Brady level of appearances where it's just like it's so many. It's like, how many is it? It's like it can't fit on one hand. I know that much. But we'll leave a rating and review. That's what you can do down on Apple iTunes. There's also a few other platforms. Typically, people will give 5 stars, but it's up to your own discretion. Sometimes people will leave a 1 star just to, go against the grain, even though they did enjoy the podcast. So thank you to every single person for listening to another episode of Iron Culture. We'll catch you in insert date here, and we'll see you in that next episode. Until next time.